So welcome everybody. My name is Dion Fulmer. I'm director of the World Bank's Research Department. I'm really excited to host this policy research talk today. Some of you may know these talks provide us an opportunity to present work coming out of the research department, sharing with each other, sharing outside of the department, and also sharing with people outside the World Bank. I just want to welcome all our online audience, both on WebEx and YouTube. For those on WebEx, we're doing things a little differently this time. You'll all be flipped over into the panelist mode so that hopefully when we get to the Q&A, you can all come in live. So if you don't, since you'll be a panelist mode, you might want to make sure your camera's off if you don't want your camera to appear, and I'd ask you to mute as well. Policies in low and middle income countries. My colleague Hanan Jacoby, who's a lead economist in the sustainability and infrastructure team in the department, in the research department, will discuss how behavioral economics can provide insights into patterns of consumer behaviors, which can then help shape public policies related to electricity and water provision. We're grateful to have Richard Demenya today as discussant. Richard is the chief economist of the Sustainable Development Practice here at the bank. He was previously a senior advisor in the water practice, and also previously a lead economist in each of the Africa, South Asia, and LAC regions of the bank, so he's been around the institution. Prior to that, to joining the bank, Richard was economics professor at the University of Adelaide. With that, I'll turn it over to Hanan, who will talk for approximately 45 minutes, after which we'll hear from Richard for about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll conclude the session with Q&A from the audience. And as I mentioned, if you have a question, please just put your name in the chat and I can call on you. If you're following on YouTube, please submit your question in the chat and that'll get relayed to me. With that, okay, over to you, Hanan.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, it's slides.
All right, very good. I hope you can hear me okay. All right, so I want to thank Dion for that introduction, and I'll thank Richard in advance for his comments, and thank you all for tuning in today. So governments all over the world are spending considerable sums providing basic utility services such as water and electricity. So naturally, the provision and the pricing of these services are major policy concerns. And sort of the policy questions that arise can be organized into 4 bins. There's questions of cost recovery, how much to charge for the service versus, say, charging for connection to the utility. There are issues of expanding access to the service, say, to underserved regions. And the question, of course, is the willingness to pay for the service high enough to justify expansion? And if not, how much of a subsidy will be required to the utility to bring it out to a particular area? Then we have questions of affordability. How should the so-called social tariff be set? That would be, say, the lowest price, the lowest tariff in the tariff structure. How should we set that? What are the welfare and distributional impacts of subsidy reform? Of course, that's a big issue in energy. And a related point is, which is also coming to the fore more in recent years, particularly, is conservation and efficiency goals. So how do consumers respond to conservation incentives, such as peak load pricing? And what is the role of providing usage information in enhancing conservation efforts? So that's an issue we'll talk about today. So broadly, how does neoclassical economics, and by that I mean sort of your Econ 101 basic price theory, how does it approach these policy questions? And so there's a toolkit that is in wide use that we use to look at these questions, and it consists really of two tools, two graphs, you might say. The first is looks at the extensive margin, which is the margin of connection to the utility. And we have an extensive margin demand curve. As the number of connections increases, the willingness to pay goes down. So as you connect, say more and more, in more and more remote areas, the willingness to pay for the service may go down. So that's the idea of a downward sloping extensive margin demand curve. And then there's an average cost of providing a connection, which is also declining in the number of connections. Now, the reason for that is that utilities are characterized by high fixed cost, to build the plant and equipment and the distribution network and so on. And so there's a falling average cost of connecting a customer. So you have this kind of picture. And in this case, the way it's pictured, this is not a viable utility because the average cost is everywhere above the willingness to pay. So a simple cost-benefit analysis indicates this is not a viable utility. Now, this picture is literally was estimated. The two figures, the two curves in this diagram, were estimated in a recent article by Lee et al. In looking at rural electrification in Kenya. So this was they used this tool to answer the question, should we expand electrification in rural Kenya? And they came to the conclusion that it was not viable to do so. Now, the second tool in the box looks at the intensive margin of usage. That is, say, usage within a billing cycle for a consumer as a function of price. So the typical price schedule will have a low price for the service up to a particular threshold of usage, beyond which the price will increase. So this is the increasing block tariff, IBT, and I'll come back to this again and again throughout the talk. There will be consumers who have low demand, who are, let's say, poor, and they will choose to consume on the low price block here, and they'll face the low price. And there'll be high demand consumers, let's say the rich, who will be on the high price block. And what you can see is that the increasing block tariff is a form of price discrimination. It allows the utility to efficiently raise revenue by charging higher prices to high demand consumers. But this basic tool, this basic diagram, you might say, is really underlies a lot of policy analysis. How to get at the impacts of price reform, tariff reform in utilities, and it's been used in a recent article by Sean McCrae, for example, to look at electricity demand in Colombia. Okay, so that's the neoclassical toolbox. What is behavioral economics about? Well, it's largely about inattention, or lack of attention to the true price, to one's true ability, inattention to the future, and inattention to future circumstances by anchoring on present circumstances, so-called projection bias. And this is all from Chabet's recent survey. So we're going to focus on these two types of inattention in this talk. You certainly may have heard of nudges, as popularized by Taylor and Sunstein's book. So nudges are really about getting consumers to pay attention in large measure. And nudges consist of things like changing the default option, say on a 401k, change the default contribution option. Social heuristics, for example, showing how your peers, how much they're spending on electricity, how much electricity they're using, showing that on the electric bills. That's so-called social heuristics. So nudges, as described by Taylor and Sunstein, constitute sort of a normative program of improving decision-making on the part of consumers. So consumers are quote unquote irrational. Nudges move them toward rational, more rational decision-making. And in fact, we have a unit in the bank that focuses on finding such nudges. But the point I want to make here is the critical point is that nudges are often not costless. To be sure, changing the default option on a 401k may be a have trivial costs, but there are other kinds of nudges, like providing individually tailored information that are not costless and should be subjected to cost-benefit analysis like any other intervention that we talk about. So can we apply the insights of behavioral economics to utility policy questions? And I'm going to answer that in the affirmative, of course, but before I get to the answer, I want to take a detour, a short detour, talk about methodology. And I'm going to be discussing a couple of experiments, randomized experiments involving utilities, partnering with utilities. Now, why are utilities amenable to these kinds of experiments? So they have a fixed customer base. So you're really looking purely at the intensive margin in these kinds of experiments, which is good. And you are looking at a homogeneous good like electricity or piped water, the consumption of which is metered by the company. So you have a very precise measure of usage at a very high frequency, typically. These conveniences were not lost on economists early on. Even in as early as the late 70s, there were randomized experiments done with electrical utilities to understand the response to time of use or so-called peak load pricing of electricity. And the idea was to estimate how much consumers gained as a result of this kind of having these meters installed, and was it worth the cost of this technology? Subsequently, and more recently, economists have looked at real-time pricing, which involves the smart grid technology, to how that affects electricity use, using experiments again, and more broadly, in a recent survey article or synthesis article in Science, Alcott and Melanathan have advocated for randomized experiments to look at energy pricing and efficiency interventions, particularly those with a behavioral kind of twist to them. So with that, let me turn to the experiments that we did in Vietnam. Now, when I say we, all this work is joint with my colleague Tuan Do in the research department. The electricity experiment asked the question, what is the value of providing usage information in real time when consumers are inattentive? And this is also joint with Lanfeng Li. And the work is still in progress, as you'll see. The piped water experiment asks, how should new utility services, of which piped water in our setting is relatively new, how should they be priced when consumers unwittingly form habits? And I underscore here the behavioral element of both of these studies with those terms, as we'll see. So they're a combination of sort of standard economics and some behavioral science. So let's turn to the electricity experiment. And before I get into the weeds, I want to talk again about increasing block tariffs. So increasing block tariffs are ubiquitous all over the world, and the reason for that is they help the utility recover their costs. They're a form of progressive taxation. The rich are pay more, but what isn't always recognized is that they can create a welfare distortion. That is, they can impose costs on consumers when consumers face demand uncertainty. when the demand over the billing cycle for for the service is uncertain, the consumer is not sure what price they're going to face. So their day-to-day decisions about how much electricity or water to use is based on a marginal price that is uncertain. They're not sure about it, and that's going to create distortions, as I'll discuss momentarily. Now, these welfare distortions are compounded when consumers, in addition, are inattentive to their past usage. Okay, and that implies, in other words, they're even further misinformed about the marginal price. They really can't, they're not keeping track of, where they are in the increasing block tariff schedule at any point in time. That's the issue. Now, policy intervention can't really fix the uncertainty problem, but it can potentially ameliorate the inattention problem by providing information about past usage. And the question we're addressing here is whether providing such individually tailored information, which is costly, is worth it in terms of the gain, the welfare gains. By eliminating this distortion, it could potentially improve welfare, but is it enough to justify the cost? So to answer this question, we did an experiment in urban Vietnam, in the town of Vinh Phuc, in the northern part of Vietnam. And Vietnam has a very fast-growing residential power demand in urban areas, and that's driven by the adoption of air conditioning. As you see, this new air conditioning unit in Vinh Phuc is typical. So households are adopting air conditioning. Air conditioning, uses up a lot of electricity. So the reason we chose Vinh Phuc is because they had rolled out digital metering, which allows us to implement our intervention of providing real-time usage information. I should just say, and this is true both for the electricity work and also for the piped water study later, I'll talk about later, bill payment default is extremely rare in Vietnam. So default on bills is not an issue here. The experiment involved 1,300 electricity customers, all of whom owned at least one air conditioning unit. And the interventions, there were two interventions that we randomized. The first was a price intervention where so the figure here, the green is the sort of the typical block tariff that households will face. It's actually the tariff schedule that electricity customers will face. And we introduced a conservation bonus, which effectively raised the price of the second block price substantially. And then we had the second intervention, which was cross-randomized with the conservation bonus, was providing every couple of weeks we provided a text message giving the household its usage for that billing cycle, its cumulative usage, and how close they were to reaching the 200 kilowatt-hour threshold, which got them into the higher price block. We have 5 months of daily consumption data, including hot and cool months. Now, the role of air conditioning is critical here. This is sort of the time series of daily consumption, average across households, and also of relative temperature, heat index, which is a combination of temperature and relative humidity. That's the green. So 80% of the day-to-day variation in electricity usage in our sample is explained by variation, day-to-day variation in the heat index. Okay, so air conditioning is really driving consumption patterns in this population. Demand uncertainty within the billing cycle is quite important. And so what we have here is the coefficient of variation in daily usage within a billing cycle. So That's a measure of the uncertainty in demand, and you see that particularly in the hot season, you have also high uncertainty. Now, why is demand uncertainty important here? Let's go to the case of where there is no uncertainty, where households know exactly where their demand curve is, in fact, for the billing month. So let's look on the left side here. That's our picture right out of our toolbox, and we have the high demand consumers on the high price block, the low demand consumers on the low price block. Now let's consider there's a sort of a continuum of consumers with different demands. So there's a higher demand household, and their choice, where their demand curve intersects the price line, will put them right exactly at the threshold for the next price block. And if you increase demand a little bit more, so you have another household, they're also going to be consuming at the threshold, as will this household. So there's actually a range of household demand that will put the household exactly at the threshold. And so what you will see in this scenario is a bunching that will occur at the threshold, a bunching of households who will be consuming exactly at their monthly consumption will be exactly at the threshold. And those of you who do public economics and work with notches and kinks and so on and know exactly what I'm talking about here. There's a bunching. With uncertain demand, the story is quite different. With uncertain demand, you're not sure exactly where your demand is going to be, whether you're going to be facing the high price or the low price. So you have to form some expectations. So you're going to make your decisions on a day-to-day basis based on your expected price, which will be somewhere in between the high and the low price, depending on how likely you think it is your demand will be at the end of the day, will be on the high price or the low price block. Now let's look at consumers. Again, there's a continuum of consumers. You have consumers with varying demands. And what will their usage be? Well, their usage will vary as where the expected price intersects their demand. Now, of course, the expected price will also vary across these consumers, but I think we can safely ignore that for simplicity. And the only point I'm trying to make is that there will be a variation in usage across these consumers. They will not exhibit bunching as in the previous example. Okay, so that's one implication of uncertain demand, and the second implication, which I talked about already, is that there's going to be a distortion or cost associated with uncertain demand. So for the low demand household, the poor household, their actual price is lower than the expected price. So the price they end up facing is the green line is lower than the expected price, their expected price, and therefore they're going to underconsume, and there's a loss associated with underconsuming electricity. And by contrast, the wealthy household, the high demand household, will use a price that is too low compared to the price they actually are facing, and so they will overconsume. But again, there's a loss associated with each of these choices. They're using the wrong, quote unquote, wrong price to make their decision. So there's a distortion. Now, coming back to the first point, if you look at the actual data, we have the monthly usage does not bunch at the 200 kilowatt hour threshold. So there's no evidence of bunching at all, suggesting that uncertainty is probably important. What about attention or inattention? I talked about inattention. I haven't shown you anything about inattention. So let me provide some evidence that consumers are attentive to some degree. And so what I want to do is look at what happens to behavior as cumulative usage for the billing month approaches the 200 kilowatt hour threshold, where the new price, the higher price takes hold. So first, I want to look at how daily usage responds to higher temperature, higher heat index. Okay, of course, as temperatures go up, to maintain the comfort level of your home, you have to use more electricity. But the issue is how you change that over the billing cycle. So if consumers are perfectly inattentive, they have no clue what their usage is, right? Then the response of consumption to higher temperature should be just a flat line. There should be no change as you get closer to the threshold. We find that's not the case. We find that the response is actually attenuated as you get closer to the threshold. And here's the idea. You know, as you get close to the threshold and you realize that your price is, you know, is starting, the price of electricity is going to be higher as you use more. And when there's an increase in temperature, you may want to dial back the comfort level in your home. So whereas before you were far away from the threshold, you didn't think the price effectively was lower. So you don't adjust, you just keep the same comfort level. So that kind of adjustment attenuates the increase in power usage that would otherwise occur when temperatures go up. So that's some evidence of forward-looking behavior and attention. The second piece of evidence comes back to our conservation bonus. So of course, you know, the conservation bonus effectively raised the price of electricity. If people were, and therefore they should, you know, people will lower their consumption. If they were completely inattentive to how their usage was changing over the billing cycle, there would simply be a constant response, a negative response to the conservation bonus. But in fact, we find that the response is getting larger as your usage approaches the threshold where that conservation bonus is going to bite. So that's plausible evidence that people are attentive to their usage. There's some attentiveness, but we don't really know how much. We need a quantitative model to sort of put some numbers on this. Before I get to that model, I want to talk about the second intervention that we did in this experiment. So we randomized this text message program, and what we find in a nutshell is that in the text messages were given out on an afternoon typically. What we find is on the next full day after the text message was received by a household, the consumption of that household, electricity consumption, falls by 3%. But only when on that day the household is close to the 200 kilowatt hour usage threshold. So this suggests that the SMS is actually increasing their attention, at least for that day. Now, let me flesh out that result a little bit. So this is the result here. This is the coefficient on getting a text message. So this is when the text message is received on the previous day, and you are within 40 kilowatt hours of the 200 kilowatt hour per month threshold. Then you respond. If you're away from the threshold, a household doesn't respond at all. Okay. Now what we're doing is comparing two households on the same calendar day, exact same calendar day. One household has been randomly assigned to the text group and received a text on that day, on the previous day, and the other household has been randomly assigned as a control group with no text message. So that's what we're comparing. Just to check whether this is not some sort of spurious result, we've also looked at we do some placebo tests. Briefly, we ask whether it matters if you whether you received a text tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Of course, this should have no effect on your consumption behavior, and it doesn't. It's not just being randomized into the text group. It's actually getting the text the previous day that matters. Okay, and we can do some other placebo tests that indicate this is a real effect of the text of that information. Now, the question is, sure, SMS may increase your attention for that day, but what is what is the benefit to the household of having their attention increased? So for that, again, we need a quantitative model, or what's sometimes called a structural model. So the way we do that, and this is where the behavioral economics comes in and blends in with the traditional economics, is we assume that households make their decisions based on their perceived usage of electricity over the cumulative usage. And the perceived usage is a weighted average of their actual usage and a default or a heuristic. Say, for example, the usage is proportional to the number of billing days that have elapsed. The SMS the SMSs that we sent, the text messages, increase the weight that the household puts on their actual usage. It makes actual usage more salient to them, so they increase the weight on actual usage in their decision process. So we want to estimate the attention weight in this population. The way we do this is to note that the expected price, and we talked about expected price a couple slides ago, we now want to make that expected price depend on their perceived usage. Of course, when perceived usage is very high, then people have a higher expected price. But the expected price will vary over the billing cycle along with perceived usage. And so our quantitative model then relates daily consumption choices to the expected price each day of the billing cycle. And from that, we've done some preliminary estimation, and we get the following kinds of results. First of all, the attention weight that we estimate is about 0.6, which is very, it's far below 1, which would be perfect attention. So households pay attention, but they're far from perfectly attentive to their usage. And we can now calculate from the model or simulate from the model the value to consumers, and we do this for the hot months, for the high usage months. We can ask, what is the value of electricity to consumers for that month on average? And we can subtract from that the actual expenditures, not the expenditures not what they expect to pay based on their expected price, but what they actually are paying based on where they are in the price block during the course of the month. And we can take the difference, and that's sort of the net value to the household of electricity for the month. And so with imperfect attention, which is what we estimate, households have a value of about $7 per month for their electricity use in this context. But now the interesting thing we can do is we can say, let's consider a counterfactual scenario where households are perfectly attentive. So somehow we make households perfectly attentive. We increase their attention weight to 1. Now they're making better decisions, more informed decisions about their electricity on a day-to-day basis, and we can compute the value of this electricity to them net of its actual cost. We find it's it's a little bit higher, as you'd expect, but only a little bit, only about 10 cents a month. So the benefit of being perfectly attentive for the whole month is only about 10 cents a month. Again, these are preliminary results. So I don't want to oversell them. Of course, the SMS that we sent, the intervention that we did in the experiment, is only raising attention for perhaps a day. So the benefit of being attentive for the whole month is only 10 cents. So the cost of the SMS had better be really low to justify it as a policy option, at least based on our preliminary estimate. So increasing block tariffs do create distortions. Part of the distortion is due to inattention. Policy can only affect the inattention through information. But since the cost of inattention is small, the welfare gains from providing this usage information is also likely to be small. So looking forward, so that summarizes the electricity experiment thus far. And looking forward in this sort of metering space, there are many research opportunities out there involving new technologies for metering. Jack and Smith have recently published an article looking at prepaid metering in South Africa, where there's high default, and they find that it reduces default on electricity bills, which is not a problem, as I mentioned, in our context, but it's certainly a problem in many countries. And with the rollout of smart grid and real-time pricing, where also you could have meters in the home showing usage over the billing cycle, these have been looked at in the U.S. and developed country context, but a lot more work is needed to understand the implications of these technologies in developing countries. So with that, let me turn to the pricing, water pricing experiment. So the big picture here is access and cost recovery. As we discussed at the very outset of the talk, the decision to provide utility services to an area, say, is traditionally based on a cost-benefit analysis that compares willingness to pay with the cost of connection. So willingness to pay is a critical component of assessing whether access should be provided. Similarly, willingness to pay is a critical element in thinking about optimal pricing, particularly the optimal two-part tariff. So optimal two-part tariff involves, what price do you charge for the service versus the fee for connecting to the utility. Okay, and there's a trade-off between these two prices, the two parts of the two-part tariff that involve a trade-off. And Auerbach and Pelleccio many years ago showed that you want to charge a price above marginal cost, so marginal cost of, say, electricity generation and distribution. You want to charge a higher price than that to consumers, and you use the proceeds to reduce their connection fee to allow poorer households or low willingness to pay households to connect to the service. So that's the basic trade-off with a two-part tariff. Now, so willingness to pay again is a critical component. Now, what if household preferences are not fixed over time? In other words, what if households it takes some time for households to get used to using the service, or they have to grow to like it and value it. In other words, what happens if there's habit formation? Well, then the question of when to assess willingness to pay becomes salient. Do you use the willingness to pay elicited before habits are formed, or the willingness to pay for the service after habits are formed? And so that's the issue we want to address in the piped water experiment. The setting now is rural Vietnam, a relatively prosperous commune in the Red River Delta. Now, prior to having piped water available, households generally used rainwater that they collected in tanks. They used the water for drinking and cooking after boiling it, and also for showers. So piped water, provides really convenience and higher pressure for things like showers and washing and so on. But it has not fully displaced rainwater in our setting. So households still have these concrete tanks above their homes to collect rainwater. Now, we partnered with a private water utility that acted like a private company, but was subject to government rate regulation. And they provided us with cost information, which we think is reasonably accurate. So we're going to use that a little later. But the key point is that this utility only came into being, only started operating, I should say, 3 or 4 years before we started the experiment. And households were being connected throughout this period. So this is a relatively new thing in this commune, piped water. So our experiment involved 1,500 water customers, followed over about a 3-year period. And we divided them into 3 groups randomly. And each group got a series of price discounts on their piped water, starting with a 50% discount, then a 75% discount on the price, and then they reverted back to no discount. There was always a group at any point in time that had no discount at all, so it was like a control group. And these discounts lasted 6 months. Every time there was a new discount was applied, the households were informed in a couple different ways beforehand to make the price change salient to them. And of course, we have monthly metered consumption data. Before I get into the results, there's good evidence of habit formation in utility services, but it comes from basically electricity studies. There are several well-identified, very carefully done studies showing persistent responses to price changes and conservation programs. So for example, after a conservation program has expired and the incentives have gone back to normal, households continue to conserve energy and to behave as though they've changed their behavior, apparently. So that there's good evidence of this in developed and developing countries. So what about piped water customers in our commune? Do they form habits? Well, the way to think about this is to take our intensive margin demand picture and look at 2 consecutive months of consumption. In the first month, in the lower panel, we're going to give a subsidy to consumers, and they're increasing. Of course, they move down their demand curve and increase their water usage. Now, what happens is as they form habits, and this shifts the demand out in the subsequent month. So the current month now, the demand is shifted out, which means that at any price, at any current price, usage has gone up. Okay, do we find evidence that this is actually what's happening in our experiment? And the answer is yes. If you look at monthly usage, it's negatively associated with the price in the current month, contemporaneous price. And it's also negatively associated with the previous month's price. So that's kind of the reverse of this diagram. As price goes up in the previous month, consumption goes down in the previous months, there's less habits being formed and lower demand. Now, are consumers aware of this process of habit formation? And this is this is sort of where the behavioral economics enters the picture. So do consumers internalize the future effect of today's piped water consumption? So, when, just to make it concrete, when the household member is taking their shower with a high pressure, do they think about how having a longer shower will increase the desire to take long showers in the future, or do they form their habits unwittingly, naively assuming unchanging future preferences? So, intuitively, our intuition tells us that it's implausible. The scenario where you're taking a shower a longer shower in order to, build habits for, to enjoy showers more in the future seems highly implausible. And indeed, the lack of awareness of habit formation is consistent with evidence of projection bias in various studies, and in particular in recent experiments, which have been very carefully designed and show strong evidence that consumers lack sophistication in their habit formation, and therefore are basically unaware that this process is happening to them. And it's also consistent, this projection bias idea is consistent with our own data, our own experimental data. So let's just take it as a given that households exhibit this projection bias. They're not aware of their habit formation. What are the implications? The first implication is that there's a long-run demand curve that incorporates habit formation, and that's distinct from the short-run intensive margin demand curve, which fixes habits as constant. So again, let's go back to our diagram from the previous diagram. We're now going to consider a permanent reduction in the price of water. Of course, that will increase usage in previous months, which will build habits, increase demand, shift demand out, I should say. And if you now connect the dots, what you get is the long-run demand curve. So the purple line is the long-run demand curve, and you can see that there's a greater response to the price on account of habit formation. So the long-run price elasticity, the demand elasticity is greater in the long run than the short run. And our estimates, which again are based on a quantitative model, our estimates suggest that the long-run price elasticity of demand is almost 3 times greater than the short-run elasticity. Now, both elasticities are still relatively small, but the long-run elasticity is considerably greater than short. So this diagram is being reflected in our results, our estimations. Now, why is that important? We need to know the long-run demand elasticity to talk about optimal pricing policy. That's what the utility faces, the long-run demand curve. The second implication of projection bias has to do with willingness to pay, which, as I said, is a critical issue for policy. The willingness to pay, you can think about an ex-ante willingness to pay. And by ex-ante, I mean prior to connection to the utility. There's hypothetically a demand curve you can think about before any habits have been formed, which is the area under that demand is the ex-ante willingness to pay. Now, this is hypothetical, but you can certainly elicit the willingness to pay before anybody has connected to a utility. That's a completely feasible thing to do, and that's exactly what the Lee et al. Study, which I cited at the very beginning, that's exactly what they do in rural Kenya. They elicit the ex-ante willingness to pay for an electricity connection. So the point I want to make here is that the long-run demand it looks like this, and the ex-post willingness to pay, which accounts for habit formation, is by necessity greater than the ex-ante willingness to pay. Okay, and the idea here, this is an implication of projection bias. And why is that? Because if I could anticipate my habit formation perfectly, then when you elicited my ex-ante willingness to pay, I would just tell you it's the ex-post willingness to pay, because I understand that I'm going to be accumulating habits as I use the service. The idea then is that projection bias creates a wedge between your ex-post and your ex-ante willingness to pay. And in fact, we can estimate the magnitude of this wedge, and it's quite large. We find that the ex-post willingness to pay for piped water is about more than 3 times greater than the ex-ante. Ex-post is greater than the ex-ante by a factor of 3 or more. So, and again, the decision to connect is based on ex-ante willingness to pay. So let's now put these.
Hanan, can I just ask you? You're kind of running out of time, so if you can wrap up in as few minutes as possible.
Yes. Yeah, I have really 2 slides left.
Great.
Putting these ideas into practice, we can come back to the question of the 2-part tariff. Again, the question is, how do you set prices, particularly the price and the connection fee, to most efficiently recover your fixed costs as a utility when consumers form habits? And the basic implication of habit formation and projection bias is that you want to defer the consumer's payments until they've formed habits. So in other words, you want to tax consumers' future selves in order to subsidize their present selves. Their present selves are the ones who are making the connection decision. The future selves are the ones who have habits already formed. That's the idea. Now, the way, there are 2 ways to do this. The first is to simply charge a markup above marginal cost. That is, you charge a price for the service above its marginal cost, and you use the proceeds to lower the connection fee. So that's one way. But a markup has a downside, which is it creates, it's like a tax. It creates a distortion. So you want to, ideally like to eliminate that distortion. And you can do so by charging, instead of a 0 markup, and charging a monthly fee, a recurrent fee to use the service. A bit like a mobile phone plan where you have unlimited usage. Now, of course, with mobile phones, the marginal cost is basically 0, so you can, unlimited usage is like the zero price. But the idea is to have 0 markup and a monthly fee. And if you do that in our setting, we can show that the welfare gain, given the cost of the utility, given the fixed cost that our water utility needs to recover, the going to a recurrent fee with 0 markup is yielding a 12% welfare gain over a markup and a connection fee pricing model. So with that, the main takeaway, I think, from this analysis is that behavioral economics tells us it matters when willingness to pay is elicited. If there were no projection bias in a setting where habits are being formed, it wouldn't make any difference when you elicited willingness to pay. But if there's projection bias, which behavioral economics suggests is important, then it makes a big difference, potentially. Because if you do a cost-benefit analysis based on ex-ante willingness to pay, you may reject a socially desirable project, like as in this diagram here, where the average cost is strictly above the demand. But if, in fact, ex post willingness to pay were much greater, the project could be actually a desirable one from society's point of view, and you're not doing that. So that's a cost to society. So let me conclude then, giving you a couple of examples of behavioral economics enriching our Econ 101 toolkit and providing insights that allow better policymaking. And I would suggest a formula for future progress is a combination of economic theory, behavioral science, and experimental methods. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Hanan. Let's turn it over to Richard. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please just put your name in the chat and I can call on you when the time comes. Thank you. Richard, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hanan. Thank you, Dion. Firstly, let me say that I'm certainly honored to be asked to comment on this. This is first-rate work of immense relevance to what we do in the bank. And of course, the quality is beyond reproach. A little confession, when Hanan first asked me whether I'd comment on this work, I was really enthusiastic because every time you get to read something that Hanan does, you learn a tremendous amount that's new. Then I suddenly learned it was about behavioral economics that I know nothing about. So in advance, my apologies if what I say is less relevant than it ought to be. But much of what we've heard is standard neoclassical economics. So hopefully I have something that might be somewhat relevant to share, to suggest. So let me start with a bunch of sort of small little comments in terms of both papers, what we've heard, and perhaps some issues that might be worth exploring later on as the team go on to work on this. So, sorry, let me get this full screen. Okay, on the first paper that we had, I think one of the notable aspects is that, of course, you've managed to get experiments, which is very rare to do in these sorts of circumstances, especially getting utilities to agree either to share data or do experiments, tremendous work. So kudos to the team for actually having got there. Now, in terms of IBTs, the increasing block tariff, the key finding, if I may oversimplify and summarize it thus, is that consumers don't respond much to the higher price bracket, and they don't respond even when information is actually provided. Therefore, the welfare benefit that you discover is reasonably low. It goes from $7 to $7.10 a month, which by any standards does seem to be quite low. So the question then must be, why is it that you actually find that? And there seem to me to be two possibilities. One possibility might be that the level of prices is so low that consumers don't really care. So, you know, an issue that I didn't see you exploring and perhaps you might want to explore is what proportion of income the electricity bill comprises for the average consumer in the higher range and the lower range. And how might this compare to, say, prices and proportional prices in other countries? Because clearly you'd get this result of prices for electricity or the utility prices are so low that consumers simply don't regard it as important. So when you send them an SMS message, it's really not important enough for them to worry about this. In other words, the benefits don't outweigh the cognitive costs of either looking at the message or of changing behavior. There's another possible explanation, and we do get a kind of a partial sense of whether this is or isn't at play, is that it may well be, when you're talking about the two blocks, the differential between the two blocks is too low. If the differential between the two blocks is too low, then consumers don't really care very much if I go from 200 kilowatts from one block to the other. And one way of trying to, I guess, unearth these differences, and we did see a couple of graphs on this, is to try to infer what the elasticity of usage with respect to heat is across the two blocks. And we did get a graph, but we got it in terms of eyeballing. It would be good to see if there are statistical differences there. Another important thing perhaps to look at is whether there are any discernible statistical differences in the consumers who are on the lower block relative to those that are in the upper block. Clearly, you'll get differences in consumption levels, but are there any other differences that you can work out? Are there differences in income? Are there differences in size of households? And it seems to me that unless we know why we are seeing this behavior, it's going to be somewhat hard to dispense with policy advice that we can be confident about. A general finding, though, I certainly believe, and it's a finding that you read about in many different circumstances, and certainly in terms of a lot of the water utilities, there's been work done by Dale Whittington for a number of organizations, where he finds the same thing when it comes to water pricing. And in IBTs, generally consumers seem to respond to some kind of an average price and not a marginal price. And one of the explanations that's given is, rather than this behavioral economics one, is that consumers respond to average prices because they understand that, and that you can do household budgeting quite well when dealing with actual average prices, rather than having to worry about these marginal prices that entail cognitive problems and are difficult to know when you are or are not at a threshold. Another issue that people seem to worry about when talking about IBTs, and again, you have the data to be able to answer this question, is a distributional implication. Whether it's water or electricity, what we know is that poorer households tend to be more numerous. There are more people living together in a single household. And if there's more people, no matter what you do, consumption levels in the aggregate, if not per capita, will be higher. So you're more likely to cross that threshold and therefore pay more. So it could well be, as contrary to what policymakers think, is that IBTs may end up being regressive rather than progressive. And it is alleged that the evidence is not terribly strong, but it is alleged that this is certainly what you tend to see in terms of water. So it'd be great to see if you actually find this also in terms of the Vietnam example. So all in all, I think we are converging to the point that IBTs may not really be as beneficial as is so widely claimed, even though they're widely used, both for reasons of equity and, it is argued, also for reasons of efficiency, but they may not be curbing demand in the ways that we might be wanting them to. Let me then very quickly move to make a couple of quite obvious points when it comes to the second paper that you've done in terms of habit formation and demand. And for all our listeners, let me oversimplify the result again and simplify it in the following ways. That what you find is that water usage in this particular context is like an experience good. Therefore, it is habit forming. The more you use the good, the more your demand is likely to increase, obviously up to a certain limit. And therefore, if you face an experience good, perhaps one way of pricing is to eliminate the entry fee or to reduce it, and then to subsidize that in subsequent periods with some kind of marginal cost pricing, and also to have a low price in earlier periods so you can begin to build demand on the intensive margin, and perhaps in later periods you might be able to increase the price if that is feasible. And this really seems to me to be quite realistic and an accurate description of the case that you have found. But of course, as a matter of curiosity, it might also be interesting to ponder why it is that very often, when it comes to what seem to be experience goods, we also observe the reverse. That is, we find a very, very high entry fee and sometimes even a zero marginal cost for users. Many of you will be familiar with or might have read or seen a reference to this famous paper. I think it came out in the QJE sometime in the 70s, called The Mickey Mouse Monopoly, written by Walter Oy. And here he was worrying about why is it that Disney World and all of these entertainment places, by the way, I don't know if it's true, I've never been to any of them, apparently they charge you a very high entry fee to get into Disney World and zero marginal cost for any of the rides. So the rides are all free. And the question then becomes, is clearly the rides are an experience good. You have one ride, you have tremendous amounts of fun, you have the second, the third, and the fourth, and surely you should be charging the marginal cost rather than an entry fee. We observe something similar, though not identical, when it comes to Amazon Prime. And here you can check on the internet. What you do is you pay a lump sum fee to get in, and it is claimed 100 million goods that will be shipped to you within 48 hours, all for free. So why is it that we have this $150 or whatever it is that we actually pay as an entry fee, but nothing thereafter? And some fancy gyms also have this sort of thing where you have a very high entry fee, but zero marginal cost, zero monthly payment thereafter. And of course, there are some phone plans as well that go one way and some the other way. This is just purely conjecture on my part as to why we see this in some cases and not others. It may well be, as Walter Roy has conjectured, for example, that what you want is to lower the marginal cost. If you lower the marginal cost of usage, then you maximize consumer surplus and you can extract more entry fee, particularly when you've got heterogeneity of customers. That might be one reason that you have it. Another reason that you might have this different kind of pricing, of course, might occur when you have problems of congestion, signaling, snob value, or something other. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say over here is to make for a more complete paper, it would be nice to see when you would have one sort of pricing of the kind that you are recommending for Vietnam, but yet in much of the real world, we see different types of pricing, and why we're actually observing that, even though we're talking about experienced goods in both places. Then just in terms of a small little warning before I end off, in the paper that's shared with the PowerPoint, there is talk about piped water as being a merit good, as being wonderful. Perhaps in some ways it is, but in other ways it is not, because there is an environmental burden. And many of you will know that are on this call, I see the sectors that you're from, is that very often the largest consumer of energy in a city tends to be the water utility. So the energy burden is tremendous. And of course, we want to minimize water usage for environmental reasons. So unless there are water quality benefits, I wouldn't be over-relying on the merit good argument. Then I saw at the end that you do cover this notion of the willingness to pay, the expert's willingness to pay does cover costs. And my apologies, I did not pick that up earlier. With that, let me end, stop sharing, and it's over to you, Dion and Hanan. And again, congratulations on a great piece of work.
Thanks, Richard, for those insightful comments. And since you did ask a couple of pointed questions, maybe before I turn to the audience, and again, please just put your name in the chat and I can call on you. Hanan, do you want to have a crack at sort of responding to some of those issues that Richard raised? You're muted, Hanan.
Sorry. I'll just respond. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I
okay.
can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. So just three points. Respond to the issue about the percentage of the share of electricity in the household budget. I don't have the exact figure, but I think in this setting it's non-trivial. I would say certainly greater than the share of water expenditures in our rural sample, which is much smaller. So electricity is more expensive, and so it is a non-trivial fraction, although I don't have the exact number in front of me. On the question, the issue of using average price to make decisions. I mean, this has been argued that consumers base their electricity choices on average prices from past bills. In effect, our conceptual framework is really an average price framework, because as I showed you in that graph, people are basing their decisions on expected price. Now, although expected price is a forward-looking concept, it is an average of prices. So what we're providing, I think, in this study is kind of a micro foundation, if you will, of the idea that households base their choices on some average price. It's not an average from past bills, it's a forward-looking average. So I think we're sympathetic to the idea that consumers are behaving in this way, and that's in fact part of our story. And the third point about the Mickey Mouse monopoly story, and by the way, Walter Roy was a former colleague of mine, so I know him quite well. No, this is different. Our setting is different than the Mickey Mouse monopoly story, because the utility is facing a budget constraint, or let's say the government or social planner who's deciding on the optimal price structure faces a budget constraint. they have to cover fixed costs, and that changes the story a lot. I mean, yes, if you're just a standard profit maximizing monopoly, you would want to set the price to marginal cost and extract all the surplus with the connection fee. But but once you have a budget constraint you have to meet, then there's a trade-off between setting a connection fee too high and setting a price. So it's a very different setting theoretically. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Hanan. And Richard, maybe towards the end of the session, we'll come back to you, and maybe you can pick up even on some of the questions from the audience, and maybe if you wanted to respond to anything that Hanan said, that'd be great. So we have 4 people who've kind of raised their hand at the moment. Let me just go in order, and if you don't mind sort of unmuting yourself and asking your question and putting on your camera if you feel comfortable doing so. Luz, are you there? Luz Carazo, are you there?
He says his mic is not working.
Okay. I will then ask the question on behalf of Luz, which is, do you think you can create some habits with this SMS? For example, the first month they are paying attention for 1 day after, and maybe after 3 months, they understand better and the effect is lasting longer. Okay, the second question came from Bertha. Are you there? Okay, it seems like we're unable to hear people. That's unfortunate. Okay, so let me just ask the question then on behalf of Bertha. Sorry about this, we'll fix this next time. Please, how did you obtain 2.7 to calculate the long run elasticity and the 3.25 for the ex post willingness to pay? I presume it's sort of elaborated in the papers, so maybe there's some technical detail to provide, but if you could kind of maybe give some intuition, that might be helpful. And then Hector, I'll give you 1 second. If you can't unmute, I'll read your question.
So essentially my question is with regard to the role of loss aversion of public utilities, especially with regard to the willingness to pay, and essentially this difference between the ex ante willingness to pay and the ex post willingness to pay, and whether this would be something interesting to look in complement of what has already been done now in the work of Hanan Jacoby in the context of Vietnam.
Okay, and then last is Javier. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation. My question is regarding systems in which you have to prepay to consume and how the behavior of the consumer would be different. I assume they would be more aware of what the price and how long their recharges last. I don't know if you found this type of systems in your research.
Okay, Hanan, over to you. Just again, we might have a little bit more time, so if you feel like asking questions, please put your name in the chat.
Okay. Okay. Well, the first question was, do people? I guess I could rephrase it to say, might people respond to the text messages about their usage differently as they become accustomed to receiving text about their usage? So there's sort of dynamic effects, and we haven't looked at that yet. It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. I'm not sure how. Yeah, I'm not sure how we would work that in, but we can certainly have a look at that. The second question was, how did I get the 2.7 and the 3.25? Yeah, so as I said, we had a quantitative or structural model of demand that allowed for dynamics. In other words, it allowed for your past consumption to affect your current consumption, as well as, the current price, past consumption affected your current consumption. And when we estimated that model, and from those estimates, we could back out these numbers, this 2.7 and the 3.25, along with the short run elasticity. So that's in a nutshell how we got those numbers. All the details are laid out in the paper, which I've referenced, the policy research working paper that I referenced. The question about loss aversion. So the idea, I think, is that when you have loss aversion, and I try to elicit your willingness to pay, I'm going to get a different answer if I ask you, before I give you the whatever it is. Let's say it's a mug. In these experiments, they ask people how much are you willing to pay for the mug before they give them the mug, and they get an answer, and then they give them the mug, and then people start drinking in the mug, and then they ask them, how much are you willing to pay to get rid of them? To give me the mug back. How much do I have to pay you? That is, and there's a gap between those numbers. Typically, people are averse to losing something that they've possessed. So that's an issue with eliciting willingness to pay. It's somewhat it's distinct from the issue we're talking about. We're not really talking about eliciting willingness to pay before and after connection and comparing. What we're saying is that there's a theoretically or conceptually there's a gap between ex post and ex ante willingness to pay that arises from habit formation. So I think the loss aversion issue was more, if you wanted to go out and estimate willingness to pay ex post and ex ante, you would have to contend with loss aversion as a potential explanation for a gap. But that's not what we're doing in this work. We're not eliciting willingness to pay directly in this manner. So I hope that answers that question. And the question about prepaying, I'm not really sure I follow the question. The metering, the pricing here is all, sort of pay as you go. At the end of the billing cycle, you pay the water company or the electricity company. Now there have been, as I mentioned, there have been experiments, not experiments, but there have been studies of a prepaid metering. So you pay in advance, you get a certain number of minutes, just like a phone card, and you get to use that many minutes. And if you want more minutes, you go and get some more. And that's been shown to reduce bill default. Obviously, it's just going to reduce default because you're paying in advance. But there, aside from that, there hasn't been any work with this kind of metering. So I'm not sure exactly if I answer that question, but that's all I can really tell you about prepaid metering. Thank you for those questions.
Okay, thanks. Nobody's put their name in the chat. So let me ask something about that occurred to me early on in your talk, Hanan, which is I was having trouble kind of disentangling and wondering how you separately identify the notion of certainty, of expectations and certainty with attentiveness, because it seems like the two are kind of intricately linked. And your experiment increased attentiveness, but surely when you're increasing attentiveness, you're also changing the certainty or the expectation around the price. And I just wonder whether you actually do disentangle the two, and maybe I just missed it, or whether you don't really care, but you kind of getting the net effect ultimately.
Okay. Let me describe what we do empirically, just sort of in very simple terms. What we're doing is relating your daily consumption to your past usage. I mean, think of what we're doing as a very elaborate, nonlinear, highly nonlinear regression of current consumption on your past usage. Okay, and the argument is, yeah. So how your past usage affects your consumption and how that relationship evolves over time is telling us something about your attentiveness, because it's how much do you use your past consumption information in your decisions? That's really what it's teasing out. The uncertainty part, I mean, is in the model, so to speak. It's in there, but I mean, we're not trying to get at that. But the point is that the part about attention is being, quote unquote, identified from the relationship between current consumption and past usage. I hope that helps a little.
I think so. I know where to find you, so I can follow up.
Right. I mean, I apologize, but these are conceptually quite difficult models to work with, and intuition can be difficult.
Okay, fair enough. So with that, nobody's put their name. Richard, I'll start wrapping up then. Richard, I just wanted to give you a chance to come in if there was anything you wanted to add to the discussion before I turn it back to Hanan just to close.
Yeah, just a small little point that I think is unresolvable. So I think your results are absolutely plausible, right? Especially on the water utility one, that with the habit forming and that demand goes up. And also this notion that therefore willingness to pay will increase. But we have no way of eliciting that before we decide whether to build a utility or to build the pipes or not, I don't think. So, I'm pretty sure some of our colleagues will sort of begin to worry about that. Yes, we believe that, but how can we actually infer to what extent will demand actually increase? I just thought I'd throw that in, what's your conclusion? I have absolutely no trouble with. We don't seem to have a way of finding out what the future will behold. So let me end with that.
That's exactly my point. Exactly my point. We have methods. Sorry to break in here, but we have methods of eliciting willingness to pay before people have connected. I mean, that was used in that Lee et al. Study to get at the willingness to pay for electricity in rural Kenya. But the issue that you raise is that, we have no way of knowing what people's how people forecast their future demand. And perhaps, and if they are, if they're unaware of their habit formation, they're going to give a willingness to pay that differs from what you would find ex post after connection. So yes, I agree.
Okay, Hanan, if you wanted, in addition to that, if there's any last comment you just want to make, otherwise we'll wrap it up here. I think Ryan has just given a message to everybody that all the materials will be online, and he's given the link in the chat. Hanan, any last words?
Thank you all for your attention. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming. And with that, I'll close the session. And we will not be having a policy research talk in January. We're going to pick up the series again in February. So look out for an invitation to that one kind of early February. And with that, thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.